Well, Saul was king. You remember, we've talked about Saul, been a while, but we're going to back up and review for a second here. Saul was king, and the king of Israel was God's representative because he was the king of God's people. And so he was to lead God's people as God's representative. He was to lead God's people, and in doing so, he was to live in God's way, he was to lead in God's way, and he was to model God's way. And we remember Saul failed in doing that. He disobeyed God. When he was confronted with it, he made excuses, and he never repented. And God told Saul that he was going to be replaced by another man as king. And this man would be a man after God's own heart. And we found out that that was David. And when David was just a boy, God chose him to be the next king. And he sent Samuel to David, and Samuel anointed David as king of Israel. Well, David, he followed in God's ways. He was obedient to God. He trusted God. And we saw that when David was faced with trouble, he would trust God. And we saw one example of this when he faced Goliath, when no one else in Israel would. When he stood up to the giant who was taunting the people of God and mocking their God, David said, "Who is this guy to talk about God that way?" And David trusted God and stood up against Goliath when no other soldier, no other warrior in Israel would. But this boy did. David became a great warrior, and he led Israel's army, and God gave him success because he trusted God. Saul became jealous. Saul tried to kill David, and David went on the run until Saul died. Then David was made king. Why was he made king? Because God had chosen him to be king. And the people knew it, so they went to him and they made him king. He was God's choice. And David was a great king, and he did great things, and God blessed him. And then he messed up big time. David sinned. When he committed adultery with Bathsheba, when he had Uriah, her husband, killed in battle. But David was different from Saul in that when David was confronted with his sin, what did David do? He confessed. He was sorrowful over his sin. He mourned his sin. He repented of his sin. And he got right with God and came back into right fellowship with God and followed God. So David was still king, but he had some new struggles. And the reason for this is because God forgave him. He was forgiven. But as we've been seeing over the last several chapters, there are still consequences to sin. Even when God forgives you, there are still consequences. Our sin sets things in motion. There are consequences, and there is discipline from God for our sin as well. In fact, over a third of the book of 2 Samuel is dealing with the aftermath of David's sin. The discipline from God, the consequences of that sin. And we find out David's life is really kind of in a bit of a mess because of it. His boys, his sons, they learned from his example. They followed his example and followed in his footsteps, and they sinned just like their dad. Absalom, where we find him now, Absalom is actually revolting against his dad, leading a revolt, a revolution against his dad, the king. And so we come to chapter 18, and David has fled from Jerusalem, but now they are ready for war. Now catch that. David is ready for war with his own son, ready for war with his own people. And as we read through this passage, there are times when you're reading and you think, wait. And you're like, wait, what? Now, why is this happening? What should they be doing? What is right here? And you just kind of ask these quick questions, and there's things that don't quite totally make sense because there's things are confused. You see, sin has made a mess of things. And so in this passage, there is both sin and justice. There is loyalty and disloyalty. You have God's help and God's discipline. You have victory and sorrow. You see, there's confusion here because of sin. But what we see clearly is that sin complicates life. Look at verse 1, chapter 18, verse 1. Then David mustered the men who were with him and set over them commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds. And David sent out the army, 1/3 under the command of Joab, 1/3 under the command of Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, Joab's brother, and 1/3 under the command of Ittai the Gittite. And the king said to the men, I myself will also go with you. But the men said, you shall not go out, for if we flee, they will not care about us. If half of us die, they will not care about us. But you are worth 10,000 of us. Therefore it is better that you send us help from the city. The king said to them, whatever seems best to you, I will do. So the king stood at the side of the gate while all the army marched out by hundreds and by thousands. And so David gathers his army together and he arranges them for battle. And David is planning to go with them, but they all say, no, you need to stay here. You see, because they recognize how important David is. Not only because he's king, but if he's lost, then all is lost. Their whole purpose, the reason why they're protecting him is because he's king. If he's lost, all is lost. And David is who Absalom really wants to kill. He's the main target. And so if he goes in the battle, even if they kill half of David's men, it won't stop them from attacking. It won't stop them because they're really after David. And won't stop them from trying to kill David. And so they want to protect him. And so they say, you need to stay here. David concedes and says, okay, I'll stay here. And he does. But look what he says to them in verse 5. And the king ordered Joab and Abishai and Ittai, deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom. And all the people heard when the king gave orders to all the commanders about Absalom. David basically says, take it easy on Absalom. Don't hurt him. Be nice to him. This is the final order that he gives before he sends them into battle. And all the soldiers hear it. Be nice to Absalom. But wait a minute. Does this make any sense? I mean, really? It seems kind of unreasonable. I mean, I understand he's talking about his son, but at the same time, he's sending his men into battle. Okay? They're going into battle to meet Absalom in battle because he's coming to kill David. And coming to kill all of the people with David. His family, everyone. And so he's sending them into battle against the enemy and saying, be careful not to hurt the guy who's leading them. It's a bit unreasonable of a request. But notice also what David is doing here. He calls Absalom a young man. He's thinking of Absalom as a kid, which sometimes parents we do. But he's thinking of Absalom as a kid. This suggests that he's willing to accept Absalom's actions simply as youthful indiscretion. You know, that he just made a bad decision. This was just an immature mistake. But see, David is again failing to hold his children accountable for their actions. He's trying to protect Absalom from the consequences of his sin and from getting what he deserves. Verse 6. So the army went out into the field against Israel, and the battle was fought in the forest of Ephraim. And the men of Israel were defeated there by the servants of David. And the loss there was great on that day, 20,000 men. The battle spread over the face of all the country, and the forest devoured more people that day than the sword. And so the fighting starts in the field, which is normally where they would fight out in the open, and it moves to the forest, probably because Absalom's men, as they were getting beaten, ran for cover. And they go into the forest. But David's men are skilled, they're great warriors, and they can fight in any terrain, and they win this battle. And so Israel, Absalom's army, took huge losses. But it's interesting, did you notice it says that many of those losses were from the difficult terrain, from the forest. Now he doesn't explain why, what happened. Did they trip over rocks? Did they fall in holes? What happened? But it says that many of those deaths actually happened because of the forest. But as we read this is so sad to read. I mean, David's men went to meet Israel in battle. The king is going out to fight battle against his own people. The king is part of Israel. They should be together, not against each other. They are all God's people. But Israel, God's people, are fighting against the Lord's anointed. And in doing so, they are also opposing God. Their God. He's opposing their God. Not just some foreign false God, but their God, the true God who they know is God. They are opposing him. And so it's understandable why the loss was great. They were fighting against God. Well, we come to verse 9, and even though we're in the middle of a very sad passage, this is the comic relief. So verse 9 says, and Absalom happened to meet the servants of David. Absalom was riding on his mule, and the mule went under the thick branches of a great oak, and his head caught fast in the oak, and he was suspended between heaven and earth, while the mule that was under him went on. It appears that the army is fleeing. The Israelite army is fleeing from David's men. And Absalom is on his mule. The interesting thing is the mule was a royal mount. It was what royalty used to ride in those days. And so he was seated on his royal saddle, and all of a sudden he was no longer on his royal seat. Foreshadowing. But he's going, and the mule runs under some branches, and maybe Absalom, because he was running, he was looking back, or maybe he tried to duck and couldn't get low enough. But as he's going, he hits somehow, he gets stuck in the branches, and the mule keeps going, and he's left dangling. Now, it says that his head was stuck in the branch, but it's more likely it was actually his hair got tangled up in the branches. In fact, that's what Jewish tradition says, that it was his hair that got tangled up in the branch. Because you remember Absalom? Remember how proud he was of his hair? He had big hair, and he liked his hair. Remember, it said that Absalom was perfect. And he had this hair, and he would cut his hair only once a year when it got too heavy. And when he did cut it off, he would weigh it. And who weighs their hair? But the person who's really proud of their hair. All right? So Absalom had this big hair, and he was in battle. And most likely what happened is somehow in the running away, his hair got stuck. And so now Absalom is there hanging, dangling from a tree from his hair. He was so proud of that hair, it's actually fitting that his pride became his trap. The irony, though, is that this arrogant man who promoted himself amongst the people and got people to follow, manipulated people to follow him, was now hanging there completely helpless, hanging from a tree by his hair. Keep reading verse 10. And a certain man saw it and told Joab, behold, I saw Absalom hanging in an oak. Joab said to the man who told him, "What? You saw him? Why then did you not strike him there to the ground? I would have been glad to give you 10 pieces of silver and a belt." But the man said to Joab, "Even if I felt in my hand the weight of 1,000 pieces of silver, I would not reach out my hand against the king's son. For in the hearing of the king, in our hearing, the king commanded you and Abishai and Ittai, for my sake, protect the young man Absalom. On the other hand, if I had dealt treacherously against his life, and there is nothing hidden from the king, then you yourself would have stood aloof." So this man finds him. One of the soldiers finds Absalom hanging in the tree. He doesn't do anything to him, but he goes and tells Joab about it. And Joab can't believe that he didn't kill him. It's like, this is the perfect opportunity. And Joab actually is unhappy with this man for not taking that opportunity and killing Absalom. And he says, "I would have given you a reward." And it's actually a pretty good reward. He said, "I would have given you 10 pieces of silver and a belt." Back in Judges, when we studied Judges, we remember about a man, a Levite, who went traveling to find better life. And when he got to a place, this one man hired him to be his priest. And you remember what he paid him? 10 shekels of silver and some clothing and room and board, basically. So 10 shekels of silver, 10 pieces of silver. That wasn't a small thing. He paid him that every year. So it wasn't just a small reward. He's saying, "I would have given you this great reward." But the man who found Absalom has integrity. And he refuses to disobey the king. He heard the command that David had got. Even if it was unreasonable, he heard that command, and he refuses to disobey the king. Not even for a huge reward. It says, "If you gave me way more than that, I wouldn't do it." You see, for him, money isn't the issue. He won't disobey. And that's character. And that's actually rare character, that people won't do something they think they shouldn't if they get paid well. But this man also knows Joab's reputation. He says, "So if I did this and David found out," and you know David would find out, because he absolutely would. He finds out everything. He says, "You would have stood aloof." In other words, when David found out and said, "Why did you kill my son?" Joab would just go, "Why'd you kill him?" He wouldn't come to help him. He wouldn't stand up for him. He wouldn't say, "Well, I told him to," or "I suggested he should," or "I backed him up on the." He said, "You would stood aloof." In other words, you wouldn't come to my help. In other words, this would be dangerous for me to do, and I know you wouldn't come to my rescue. You wouldn't help me. Bad idea. Verse 14. So Joab said, "I will not waste time like this with you." And he took 3 javelins in his hand and thrust them into the heart of Absalom while he was still alive in the oak. And 10 young men, Joab's armor bearers, surrounded Absalom and struck him and killed him. Then Joab blew the trumpet, and the troops came back from pursuing Israel, for Joab restrained them. And they took Absalom and threw him in a great pit in the forest, and raised over him a very great heap of stones. And all Israel fled, everyone to his own home. So Joab doesn't have time for this man's character, this man's high principles. He's like, "I don't have time to talk to you about this." At the same time, though, Joab knows that David will never be secure as king as long as Absalom is alive. And so Joab sees that he's actually doing David a favor here. He's helping David. So he does what he thinks is best for David. So he's helping David, but at the same time he's disobeying David. And it says that they struck and killed Absalom. And in these words, we have a reminder of a couple earlier situations. The exact same Hebrew words were used when we talked about striking and killing Uriah the Hittite, and David's instructions to Joab to withdraw so that he is struck and killed. We also have these words in Absalom's instructions to his servants about killing his brother Amnon. So we're reminded of these situations, and it sounds like we're supposed to think back and be reminded of these illegitimate killings, these murders that took place. But once Absalom is dead, the battle is over. The enemy has been defeated. So Joab calls off the pursuit, basically says, we don't need to kill any more Israelites. It's done. And the rest of the army that was following Absalom, they keep running and they go on home. The revolt is over. They throw Absalom's body in a pit and they make a huge pile of rocks over him. And so where there was a pit, now there's a hill of stone. But they're not just burying him here. They're marking his grave. But they're not marking his grave in order to honor him. When they pile up all these rocks, they are making a monument. They're making a monument to his death. They're making a monument to the defeated rebel. Whenever anyone sees that pile of stones, they will be reminded, here lies the dead rebel. If you remember back in Joshua, there was a guy named Achan. When God had told the people of Israel, I want you to go and you're going to attack this town and you take nothing from that town. Achan stole a bunch of stuff, hid it under his tent. Israel lost another battle. God pointed it out. Well, it's because of Achan. And after Achan was put to death, what did they do? They piled rocks over him. It's the same kind of situation. It's a monument that the one who rebelled against God, the one who rebelled is dead. And that's where he lays. Look at verse 18 then. It says, now Absalom in his lifetime had taken and set up for himself the pillar that is in the king's valley. For he said, I have no son to keep my name in remembrance. He called the pillar after his own name, and it is called Absalom's monument to this day. So this is like a little side note about another monument that Absalom had set up for himself. And earlier on, he had set this up for himself. And it's brought up now at the end of his life in connection with the rock pile monument. So there are actually two monuments to Absalom. But Absalom had set this one up so that he would be remembered. What's interesting, though, it says that he did it because he says that he has no sons to honor him. But back in 1427, we were told that Absalom had 3 sons. And so it's assumed that somehow his sons had died young before the time that he actually set up this monument. But he set up this monument because he wanted to be remembered as someone special. But his actions and the rock pile monument over his grave cancel his own monument out. He is remembered, but not for anything good. But as we read through these verses, the situation has a lot of issues. And there's a lot of layers of questions that you might ask. It's quite a mess. But remember, it all starts with David's sin and the consequences of David's sin. And then on top of that, you have sins of other people that are not dealt with or have not been dealt with. And so Absalom's rebellion and his death is the result of the turmoil in David's family, which was a consequence of David's sin. And Absalom is now the 3rd son that David has lost. But on the other hand, Absalom was a murderer. And he actually deserved death. And so, was Joab right to kill him? And like I said, it is true that David would never be safe as long as Absalom was alive. So was Joab right to disobey David in order to protect him? You see how we have conflicting ideas going on here? You can feel that tension. Well, yes, no, yes, no. On the other hand, Absalom was hanging there defenseless when Joab came along and killed him. Well, was it okay because it was in the middle of battle, or because he was just hanging there defenseless? Was it not okay? And you get these questions, and Joab, well, we know Joab had murdered before, so he doesn't seem to have qualms with murdering people. And before, when he murdered, he thought he was helping David as well. And then he had Uriah killed in battle in order to help David. And by the way, David had never done anything about those murderers. He didn't. So Joab never faced any justice for those things. And so Joab is used to justifying his wrong actions. And so here we have also the man who refused to kill Absalom, who found Absalom hanging in the tree and refused to kill him. He did the right thing by obeying David. But should David had even asked or given the order in the first place? I mean, because we know David tends to avoid disciplining those close to him, especially his kids. And I bring all this up not to give you the answers, because I don't know all the answers, to be honest. But I bring this up to make this point. Sin complicates life. Why is this mess here? Why are this confusion? Because of sin. David's and other people's. Because of sin. Sin complicates life. So whether it's yours or others around you, the sin of others around you, it makes messes, and when they're left unpunished or undealt with, the problems compound. And those issues get bigger, and there become more layers. Let me give you some examples. Just a quick, simple example. Okay, someone lied to me. So now do I trust that person? Do I trust anything they say? Or for that matter, if people lie, do I trust anyone? Who can I trust? And if this is just the way people live, then maybe it's okay. Is it okay then if I lie? I mean, everybody does it, right? And you see how this ball can just keep rolling. But this is what sin does. Well, this is just the way things are done. Or what about this one? This is a very common issue that comes up. We know what God says, what Jesus said about marriage and about divorce and remarriage. But sin has come into the picture of marriages. And things have happened within marriages. And the question is always asked, well, I know this is an adultery, but is it okay to be divorced in this situation? Is it okay to be remarried in this situation? What about this one? What about this? I mean, there's sin there. Is it okay? And see, then we have to have those discussions. We have to have those conversations, because people ask all the questions. Why? Because sin has complicated life. If there was no sin, we wouldn't have those questions. We wouldn't have those problems. We wouldn't have those issues to figure out. But we do, because sin complicates life. And it complicates life because it's wrong. Sin is wrong. It's a perversion of how things are supposed to be. It's opposed to the perfect way of God. So let me just make two applications for you here. First of all, not only does sin make life harder, but if it's left unchecked, it will bring pain and ruin. So here's my application. It's really simple. Don't do it. I know it sounds way too simple, right? I mean, really, avoid it. Avoid sin. Be obedient. Be faithful to God. Listen to the Spirit as the Spirit guides you and works in your life. And as He convicts you, listen to the Holy Spirit and follow closely after Christ. And then secondly, because God loves His children, and the book of Hebrews tells us this, because God loves His children, we can expect Him to discipline us when we sin. So you want to avoid the pain of discipline? Avoid sin. Let's obey God. Well, back to Samuel, 2 Samuel, chapter 18, verse 19. Then Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said, "Let me run and carry news to the king that the Lord has delivered him from the hand of his enemies." And Joab said to him, "You are not to carry news today. You may carry news another day, but today you shall carry no news, because the king's son is dead." Then Joab said to the Cushite, So Ahimaaz is asking, remember Ahimaaz, he's the son of Zadok, one of the priest's sons. He's been involved since the very beginning, since David ran from Jerusalem. He's been involved in there. He's been a messenger to bring messages to David so he knows what to do. And here now he wants to run to tell David, hey, it's done. We've won. God has given us the victory. But Joab says, no, you're not going to take the message today. 21, then Joab said to the Cushite, go tell the king what you have seen. The Cushite bowed before Joab and ran, so he takes off. Then Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said again to Joab, come what may, let me also run after the Cushite. So he's still not satisfied. He still wants to go tell David. And Joab says, why will you run, my son, seeing that you will have no reward for the news? In other words, you're not going to get anything for it, so just relax. Verse 23, he replies, come what may, he said, I will run. So he said to him, run then. Then Ahimaaz ran by the way of the plain and outran the Cushite. So he ran further, but he ran along smoother terrain and he was able to get there faster. Verse 24, now David was sitting between the two gates, and the watchman went up to the roof of the gate by the wall, and when he lifted up his eyes and looked, he saw a man running alone. The watchman called out and told the king, and the king said, if he's alone, there's news in his mouth. And he drew nearer and nearer. So David just assumes there's just one guy. It's not everyone running in defeat or running away from the battle. So he says, well, it's just a messenger with good news. Verse 26, the watchman saw another man running, and the watchman called to the gate and said, see another man running alone. The king said, he also brings news. So there must be more messages. Verse 27, the watchman said, I think the running of the first is like the running of Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok. And the king said, he is a good man and comes with good news. So he recognizes the way he runs. He says, it must be good news because Ahimaaz is a good man. David's making some assumptions, but anyways, verse 28, then Ahimaaz cried out to the king, all is well. And he bowed before the king with his face to the earth and said, blessed be the Lord your God, who has delivered up the men who raised up their hand against my lord the king. Then and the king said, is it well with the young man Absalom? Ahimaaz answered, when Joab sent the king's servant, your servant, I saw a great commotion, but I do not know what it was. And the king said, turn aside and stand here. So he turned aside and stood still. And so when Ahimaaz is coming, he's running up, and he calls out to David, all is well, or literally, peace. In other words, things are great, and he's so anxious to give him news, he can't wait till he gets there. So he cries out as he's coming in, and then when he gets there, he bows down to David and he gives him the message. And the message is that God has delivered you from those who were seeking your life. But notice how he states it. He says, blessed be the Lord your God, who has delivered you. You see, when he makes a statement, it's not just a statement of fact, but it's a statement of praise to God. He's emphasizing the fact that God did this. You see, God has done a great thing for you, David. But David doesn't even seem to hear the good news or recognize what God has done. He immediately asks about Absalom. He only wants to know about Absalom. Now again, this is understandable to a point. He's a dad. And we can sympathize with David. But he immediately asks, what about Absalom? And Ahimaaz gives him the answer. He says that he doesn't know what happened. Now, either he doesn't know or he doesn't really want to say. He only wants to give good news, not bad news. Because we know Joab had said, you're not going to take the message today because Absalom is dead. Well, maybe he had come up and he doesn't really know the details. He just saw something was happening. He heard Joab say that, so he doesn't want to speak about it because he doesn't have the details. But he does say, I saw a big commotion. So they wait for the other messenger. 31. And behold, the Cushite came, and the Cushite said, good news for my lord the king, for the Lord has delivered you this day from the hand of all who rose up against you. The king said to the Cushite, is it well with the young man Absalom? And the Cushite answered, may the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up against you for evil be like that young man. And the king was deeply moved and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went, he said, oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom. Would I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son. So the messenger comes in. He's like, we have good news. God has delivered you. It's the same message. But then he gets the same immediate question. How is Absalom? The Cushite replies. He doesn't say it directly, but he makes it clear that Absalom is dead. Let everyone who attacks David be like him. In other words, dead. David understands it, and he is crushed by the news. He goes to a private room and he weeps. But on the way, as he is overwhelmed with grief, everyone can hear him say, I wish I died instead. Now, on one hand, again, any father might say this. It's an understandable statement. Any father might say this. But it does seem that David's anguish goes beyond just normal mourning. David knows that this is part of God's discipline for his sin. And although Absalom is guilty of his own sin and deserves what he got, David feels responsible. He feels that he should have been dead instead. See, he's carrying great guilt as well as the sorrow. And this guilt and this pain of loss, his grief has overshadowed the good that God has done for him. And so we need to understand that. See, pain and grief and loss and guilt can cause us to close our eyes to the good that God is doing in our lives. Even God's discipline can be hard, but it shows us that he loves us. And in the midst of the struggle, there is always a blessing. There are always blessings from God as well. God is always blessing you. So don't miss the good that God is doing in your life. Well, look at chapter 19, verse 1. It says, it was told Joab, behold, the king is weeping and mourning for Absalom. So the victory that day was turned into mourning for all the people. For the people heard that day, the king is grieving for his son. And the people stole into the city that day as people steal in who are ashamed when they flee in battle. And so again, we can sympathize with David, but he at this point is destroying the morale of his men. He sent them out to war and is upset that they won. You see, he got good news of the victory, and now he is mourning the death of the enemy. It was a day of celebration, but it has become a day of defeat. The men hear about David's reaction and they sheepishly sneak into town as if they were ashamed and embarrassed, as if they had lost the battle rather than won. Verse 4 says, the king covered his face, and the king cried with a loud voice, O my son Absalom, O Absalom, my son, my son. Then Joab came into the house to the king and said, you have today covered with shame the faces of all your servants who have this day saved your life, and the lives of your sons and your daughters, and the lives of your wives and your concubines, because you love those who hate you, and you hate those who love you. For you have made it clear today that commanders and servants are nothing to you. For today I know that if Absalom were alive and all of us were dead today, then you would be pleased. So Joab goes in and confronts David and in private, but he gets in David's face. And he is very direct and he is very forceful with David. And I think on this issue, he's right. You see, David's men, his loyal servants, they risked their life for him and for his family. But David is acting as if he doesn't even appreciate it. And the way he's acting suggests that he wished that they hadn't done it, or that they had been killed instead. And Joab makes the comment, you love those who hate you and hate those who love you. Now, in the ancient Near East, the word love was sometimes used in situations or in statements like this to refer to like a covenant loyalty. So in other words, Job is saying that David is being loyal to those who were disloyal to him and being disloyal to those who were loyal to him. In other words, David is being unfaithful to his faithful men. Verse 7 says, "Now therefore arise, go out and speak kindly to your servants, for I swear by the Lord, if you do not go, not a man will stay with you this night, and this will be worse for you than all the evil that has come upon you from your youth until now." Then the king arose and took his seat in the gate, and the people were all told, "Behold, the king is sitting in the gate," and all the people came before the king. Now Israel had fled, every man to his own home. Joab's basically kind of saying to him, there's a time for mourning, but right now you need to get out there and be the king. David is at risk of losing his men. The same men who stood by him and said that they would be with him no matter what. You see, they're feeling unappreciated. They're maybe even despised or rejected by the one they had fully committed themselves to. He's acting like he doesn't even want their loyalty. But if they go, then David's in trouble. How will David remain king if he doesn't have their support? He needs their support. He needs to go out there and get with them and lead. He needs to show them appreciation. He needs to appreciate them. And so he goes out to the gate, which is where kings and leaders would sit amongst their people and would discuss life and would hear cases. He goes out there and he sits there. And all the people hear that he's there and they gather around him. And where David is going out and he's taking his place as king among his people. And it's received well. But this section ends, the end of verse 9, with this statement. Now Israel had fled, every man to his own home. It's another bittersweet note. See, David had won this victory, but Israel as a whole is fractured. Israel as a whole has lost. We see both good and bad. Again, this all goes back to David's sin. Sin has consequences. And yet God is gracious, and God helps his people who repent and trust in him. We see both good and bad. You see, sin complicates life. And sometimes it just makes a huge mess of things. Sin can bring ruin and pain, but we know that God forgives, and God blesses his people who repent. We may still deal with the consequences of sin or experience God's discipline, but God is doing good in our lives. Don't miss that. And we may get knocked down by sin or by grief or by guilt, but God is doing good in our lives. So we can get up and we can move on.